Alright, Chapter 21 covers continuity and change in East Asia, 1400 to 1800. Again, we're talking about another 400 years. As you probably are at least a little bit familiar with, China goes through a number of different dynasties. In so many ways, they mirror Egyptian society in early history. So it kind of gives you an idea. We go through these phases, or dynasties, as they call them, of a particular group of rulers until they're overthrown and the next group comes in. The main reason I'm going to go over this material isn't so much because hopefully it'll help you over a larger scheme of issues, but because for me, I'm reading material typically and I'm trying to pronounce names and it's kind of a little bit difficult and I get tripped up in that and I don't really ever absorb what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to go through some of these. Please do understand I'm from Alabama, and so I do have an accent, which I'm sure you've all noticed by now. But my pronunciation is likely not exact. I do spend some time researching how they're pronounced. I check out several different websites, which if it's helpful to you, HowJSay is one, howjsay.com. It's howj, just the letter, say.com. Forvo, F-O-R, VO.com is another that if you wanted to get in there and look up a pronunciation because you just can't seem to, you want to pronounce it in your head as you're reading it and you can't. That might help you out just a little bit. So I'll kind of hit a couple of highlights for you and make sure that as you're reading it to catch those bolded terms. The first thing of significance is the Ming Dynasty. This is one that if you ever watch any of those television shows where you bring in your ancient junk and they go, "Ooh, look how expensive this would be if you sold it today." Those sort of things. You've maybe heard of the Ming Dynasty. It was begun by Taizong, and that's spelled T-A-I-Z-U, and he was the emperor for some time. His job, he was an absolute ruler known for his cruelty and oppressiveness. Angry, violent guy, had many thousands of people executed. He is responsible for moving the capital to Beijing, and he ruled from the Forbidden City, which is a palace there in Beijing. During his time period, he had that very heavy-handed approach, very violent, as I've already said, known for flogging, starving protesters to death, etc. High government officials had to work around the emperor. Most of the time we see in the Chinese dynasties, they're going to have a fluctuation of a really strong emperor with very weak underlings, and then you'll see it flip-flop where you've got the underlings say, "We never want another super strong emperor again." So they're very strong and they kind of put in a puppet emperor. So we'll see that go back and forth. Ming emperors feared the Mongol fighters. And so the idea was we need to find a way to keep them away. And so they built the 1,500-mile Great Wall of China. One 500-mile stretch of the wall averages about 35 feet high and 20 feet across. Features a lookout tower about every half mile around. Again, talk about a bucket list. This is on mine. I would love to see it. I can't begin to imagine what it would be like, just the humbling experience of actually seeing something so large. In this particular time period, you have the Chinese government looking for the best and the brightest. They're trying to employ some of these people, and so they institute something called the civil service exams, and that's one of your terms. There were quotas that were set up for entrances into the opportunity to even take these. So they had to not just have the wealthiest come in and take the civil service exams. There had to be people from all over the nation. This is important because before this point, the wealthy were the only ones that were employed. They're the only ones that are educated, and so they were the only ones that were able to continue the legacy of the country. And so these civil service exams are meant to kind of level the playing field, and you'd hear stories of villages essentially pooling everything they've got to help propel someone from their village into the civil service exam. There is a little bit more about that on page 623 if you want to read more. It's really quite an interesting process that goes on for a considerable amount of time, and it's in several stages. Life in Ming China, you have a large towns all over the country. These are mostly manufacturing centers with textiles and paper. Other luxury goods like silk was made in these particular centers. Here you would see libraries with reference books and religious texts. For the most part, their idea of relaxing was with alcohol. Most of their alcohol was made with distilled rice, and tobacco came to them from America, and that became another part of that. Most of their diets, fish and rice, which is carried over into more modern times as well. The decline of the Ming Dynasty came because of finances. They were not financially able to keep their military up and running, and the Koreans took advantage of that. Because I shouldn't say it quite like that, because the Koreans had been protected for some time from the Japanese by the Chinese. No longer can the Chinese afford to do that, and the Japanese invade through Korea into China. They also have a series of natural disasters, including floods, droughts, locusts, etc. Very difficult time for China, and the Ming Dynasty essentially crumbled. The Manchu come in at this point. They were living in close contact before this point with the Mongols, Koreans, and the Chinese, and they end up organizing, and they found what we know as the Qing Dynasty. That's spelled Qing. The Manchu military companies were organized into units that they called banners, and each of these include families and slaves of the soldiers. So it was quite an ordeal for them to mobilize. We see the Chinese population growing under the Manchu occupation. There is also a climate change, which had nothing to do with the Manchu, it just was beneficial to them, and we see a spurt in growth in agriculture as well. Kangxi, that is Kangxi, so Kangxi was an emperor who worked hard to put the Ming and the Manchu people together, kind of bridge a gap that was there culturally and, of course, politically speaking. Qinglong, and that's Qianlong, so Qinglong worked at uniting the Chinese and the Manchus. These are important players in making a dynasty last longer. The Qing Dynasty, their armies acquired Taiwan after chasing a rebel there. Again, they use those banner soldiers, and they end up moving into Tibet and causing problems there as well. The problem with moving into Tibet, into some areas like that, you are kind of coming up really close with some of your other enemies, including the Russians. And they fought the Russians until 1689, where they came into a treaty situation. The next I want to talk about is Japan just a little bit, and you have the Ashoka. These are shoguns that promoted the Muromachi culture. That's all on page 623. It talks about the No theater, and you want to know about the No theater. This is a type of Japanese theater where they use gestures and dress to convey emotions and ideas rather than actually using words. Still has some cultural relevance even today. You also see Zen Buddhism come into play as well. We do see a large civil war break out within the Japanese, and the daimyo comes into play on page 631. These are warlords who end up essentially becoming the foundation of power rather than the emperor or the ruler. Next up is the Nobunaga. This was the first daimyo to gain power. He minted coins. He is Japan's first governor, which is Japan's first government-issued currency. And after a coup, Nobunaga is forced to commit suicide, and Hideyoshi ends up coming to power at that point. He becomes the first sole leader in Japan in over 2 centuries. Instead of having the warlords or any others come in and group lead, we now have one particular leader. Let me try that again. Tokugawa shogunate. This one comes into play. At this point, they are a peaceful ruling. They end up enacting the alternative residence system. Lords are forced to live in Endo every other year, where they leave their wives and their children as their hostages. And the idea here is they're going to keep a very tight rule on these people. I also want to mention that we see a large growth in what Japanese culture looks like. They are coming into cities. They are finding profit in artisanship, in trading, etc. You also see money lending, as in banking, becoming a large part of Japanese finance reform. You see monasteries are actually playing a role in that. They're lending money during this time as well. At the end of the Edo period, we see many types of entertainment come into play here. We see theaters, restaurants, houses of prostitution. Poor families would sell their daughters into these entertainment industries. Some of these girls became geishas, or accomplished persons. You have kabuki theater, which you've probably heard of at this point. It's got elaborate costumes, songs, dance, poetry, etc. But the reality is that Japan is located on a volcanic island. And Mother Nature has a way of leveling the playing field. When Japan's getting at the peak of their existence at that point, we suddenly see natural disasters such as earthquakes, eruption from the volcanoes, as well as strong oceanic storms. And we see this basically crumble them back down as far as the society, and they have to rebuild as well. Next up is Zhang Shi, and the voyages. He took old Arabic routes. He takes the sea world by storm. His first voyage included 317 ships. That's unbelievable, including about 20,000 to maybe up to 32,000 men with him at that point. Chinese officials are upset with his expeditions because of the amount of money it's costing them, and ultimately he does not come back with a huge payoff, which was ultimately the hope. While we are seeing this age of exploration kicking up for these particular areas, we also see the Japanese take advantage of that. There's Japanese sea bandits, or pirates essentially, that are raiding along that coastline, finding anything of value they're going to take with them. At this point, we see the Portuguese come in. They are going to do one of two things. They're going to, well, hopefully two things, but usually turns into just one. They're trading, and they're wanting to convert these people to Christianity. What eventually these Europeans figure out is that the Japanese particularly have no interest, but both the Japanese and the Chinese, they have no interest in Christianity, and often this is what we know to force them out of their countries. Matter of fact, in 1715, China ends up expelling all of the Christians. It's Matteo Ricci that I do want to point out as a success story. He's a Jesuit missionary who went to Beijing and began converting people to Christianity. Even many high-ranking Chinese officials were converted by him, as they were able to make the connection that Confucianism, which had been a long-held tradition in China, was very similar to Christianity. So they kind of highlighted those similarities and were able to build from there. In Japan, they are very interested at this point in Western tradition and Western thought. With that does come Christianity, and the Jesuits move in. They are able to use medicine to cure malaria while they're there in Japan, which does allow them to be welcomed for a short amount of time. The Jesuits also take with them technological advances, which a lot of the Japanese are fascinated with. Portugal, they also are trying very hard to get in as far as trade goes, and we see with them they are somewhat successful for some amount of time. That's all I'm going to say about 21. Do make sure you're reading, and I wish you the best of luck. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.